All right, hey everybody. So this is Josh Bruce, and we're going to be continuing to refactor the string class, specifically still looking at the split method. Now, if you remember from the last video, we sort of had our original solution, which was this here, which is what I would call a hacked prose solution. And so the reason that I say that it's hacked is because you can, if you start reading it from top to bottom, you can see that it's kind of difficult to really maintain and keep up with what is going on inside of here, right? We're going to do max splits and why. What does that actually do for us? And then we're going to build out a splits array so that we have different splits stored somewhere. And basically, it's what happens when you break down a problem and you solve the problem incrementally and do just little snippets of development. Now, the reason that I call it prose is because it leans more toward words than syntax, right? So there's not, if you look at words compared to punctuation, right, the brackets and everything like that, it's leaning a little bit heavier toward the words. Now, what we ended up doing next is we did the next solution, which was this here, and I would call this something more akin to a mathematician solution. And what I mean by that, and it's not an insult by any stretch of the imagination, is that it leans heavier on using the standard library, on using numbers and punctuation and syntax, right? I mean, it's two ternary operators. So like we don't want to say if, parenthesis, curly brace, else with parentheses around it, and then curly brace. Instead, we'll just say, parentheses, here it is, question mark for the first set of things, and then colon for the second set of things. And it's only 6 lines. And so a lot of times with mathematician sort of ways of doing things or mathematical ways of doing things, you will end up with a very terse and dense statement. But with dense statements, you sort of have to explode them, and we'll talk more about them later. And so you have to unpack everything that's going on here. Like, okay, I'm doing this preg split thing. Okay, what does that mean? Let me head over to the docs and find out what preg split means. And let me come back to the code. Okay, so this first thing is a regular expression. Well, maybe I don't know anything about regular expressions, so I have to go learn about those because I don't. And then, somebody can pass in this separator. So we're basically asking a developer using this API to know what a regular expression is and trust them to do the right thing. Then we're going to do this, and the only real difference is with this preg split, no empty flag. What is that? Okay, let me go back to preg split, right? Like, it's dense and it's very short to look at, but at the same time there's a lot of unpacking that you have to do to fully understand what all is happening here. So with that said, let me go ahead and close these. With that said, we tried a third version, and the third version is very much on the prose side because that's sort of what I do instead of the mathematics side, but the logic is much more methodical, or dare I say mathematical, right? So we basically explode the string that we have inside of the class, right? So we are dependent on the state of the class. We're going to explode that based on the separator that we get, because the preg split we were worried about with allowing somebody to do a regular expression, like what sort of security issues could come from that. Then we just check to see, are we removing the empty values? And if we are, okay, what does that mean? Well, we're going to unset the empty values from the array using array filter from the standard library. Then we're going to re-index the values from unset empty values using a standard library function called array values. And then we're going to reset what the array variable is set to be re-index values, the result of that. And then we're going to check for our max splits. We're going to divide things up, and then if the right side is empty, then we're just going to return, we're going to say array is left, and if the right is not empty, then we're going to say array is an array of both the left and the right, and then return the array, right? And that results in 31 tests, 41 assertions, and all of them pass. Now, when we got to this splitting of the array, or the slicing of the array, I just scrolled up to bisectedArray, or bisectedArray, and you might have noticed in the video, the last video, that I kind of paused there and was really quiet. And I'm sorry I wasn't explaining what was going through my head, but I was like, why can't I just use bisectedArray, right? Why can't I just do this? And that's because bisectedArray uses a different initial array. So the initial array for bisectedArray is to convert the string into an array based off of a regular expression using preg split, right? And to always strip out the empty values. Whereas with split, we're saying create the array from a separator, an arbitrary separator given to you by a user, right? A developer who is using this API. So I couldn't just copy and paste or just use bisectedArray, which was somewhat disappointing. But it got me thinking about, arrays and how prevalent arrays are in software development. Some people, call PHP a very array-heavy language, but even in Swift and Objective-C, I was using collections all the time. And I've also heard people, I've heard some criticisms of PHP that there is no tuple, right? How do you send back multiple values? Well, you use an array, right? And that's kind of what we're doing here. And so let's switch over to our playground in Swift just to get away from PHP land and demonstrate this a little bit. So there are certain things that I think as a developer, for me, it really, really helped when I started really understanding the concept of assignment and access, right? And the concept of collections and abstract, concrete, and even just language in general. So with assignment, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say str, so that's the initial string, which is hello playground right now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change that to self-contained breathing apparatus. Now, what this is it is one thing, right, str, assigned to one other thing, a string, which is actually a collection of things, those individual characters. And in fact, this should work. So I'm going to start a PHP REPL, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say str equals hello, semicolon, and then I'm going to say print str0, and in the output from the REPL you get an H, right? So in PHP, strings are just collection of individual characters, and you can actually interact with them like an array. In Swift, on the other hand, that's not really the case, but I can do something like double quote hello, at least I think I can. Yeah, so double quote hello, comma, world, exclamation mark, and if you notice, it looks, oops, value type string has no, oh, append. Yeah, value type string. So this doesn't actually create it as a class. I thought you could actually call it off of the class. So never mind. I guess you can actually interact with it that way. All right, so anyway, but we have str equals self-contained breathing apparatus. And the reason that we do this assignment, this one-to-one assignment, is because if we had to, every time we wanted to refer to self-contained breathing apparatus, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, if every time we wanted to do that, we would have to actually say all of that, that would get really old really quick, right? And so what we're going to do, what we do instead is we turn it into an acronym, right? So in this case, the acronym is SCUBA, and linguistically, acronyms are at least from my understanding, acronyms are the only ones that you can say. Initialisms are ones that you can't. So FBI, CIA, DAI, that kind of a thing. Those are all initialisms, whereas SCUBA is an acronym that you can speak, which is sort of redundant. All right, so self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, that's what SCUBA means. But again, we have to unpack it, right? We have to, so I did a lot of work with the government over the years, and basically I cannot tell you the number of meetings I was in where someone would say, you know, ConOps, and I'd be like, wait, what does that mean? And they would say concept of operations. And then I would have that long string of, okay, concept of operations. Now, you know, what does that actually mean, right? Like, give me even more details, right? Because I have to keep unpacking it, right? Now, eventually, once I get used to it and my brain's mapped properly, then I can just, somebody can say scuba, and I'm like, okay, cool, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, nice. And then I can go into a further description if I need to. Now, so with the further description, right, because this is actually the title of the patent application, there's actually a patent description, you know, that details everything like that. And so we have an array. So now we have this thing, scuba, in all caps, that is assigned to one thing, the array, that has a bunch of stuff in it. Now that array has assignments within it as well, right? Because you can only assign one thing to one thing. And so basically, if we wanted to get at the title, we would use array notation, and it would be scuba, open square bracket, 0, close square bracket. And that gives us self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Now, the assignment of 0, of that index 0 to the variable str, is implied. It's an implicit assignment. You don't get to see it. So you have to know something of the language and the way that this works to really comprehend what's going on there. So now let's do this, because over the years that acronym became so prevalent in our language that it just became a word, right? So scuba became a word. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a dictionary. So with Swift, basically you have collections. Collections can be an array, which means that they're indexed by number, and you can have a dictionary, which means they're indexed by string keys, right? Named keys. And then in PHP, we just call them indexed arrays or associative arrays. So I'm going to say definition as a string, colon, and then open a new string and say an aqualung, which is actually the common definition now, okay, for scuba. And then I'm going to say previous definition, or yeah, let's just do AKA, so also known as. And then all I'm going to do is say scuba and 0. Okay, and so now this is still an array, but it's a different type of array, right? So scuba brackets 0, that's more of what I would classify as mathematics notation, right? Because it's short words, lots of numbers, and lots of punctuation. Now with lowercase scuba, I'm going to say, sorry, I got scrum on the brain apparently. So scuba, and I'm going to say, give me the definition of scuba. All right, an aqualung, and we can also say AKA, also known as, which is an initialism. Oh, I'm still putting an R in there. Don't know why. All right, and that's self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Okay, but what's from a prose perspective, or from a non-mathematician perspective, this is easier to read, because I have less to unpack, right? Whereas with the scuba, I have to go, okay, where is scuba and what's the 0 index? With this, as long as we name our keys well, I kind of get the idea. Scuba, the definition. Okay, chances are that's the definition of scuba. All right. So now, so the top, scuba in all caps, that's an array. The scuba in lowercase, that's a dictionary. And now let's take a look at a tuple. And so I'm going to change this up, and I'm going to say I tuple, which I'm going to say stands for inferred tuple. So because we can only do one-to-one assignment, the thing on the left has to be, or the thing on the right, we have to be able to tell the computer and the compiler this one thing that just happens to have a lot of things. And so in the case of tuples, we use parentheses instead of the square brackets. So I'm just going to say 1, 2, 3. All right, so that's I tuple, and now to access it, instead of using array notation, which is the square brackets, I'm going to use object notation, which in the case of Swift is a dot, right? So there you go. I tuple dot 0 is 1. So now I'm going to say let tuple, which is the way most of us, interactions with tuples I've seen work. And basically what we're going to do is it's kind of like a dictionary, only instead of a string, instead of the key having to be a string, it's just like a standard variable. So I can say 1:1 and do the same thing for 2 and 3. All right, and then to access it, again, we're using object notation, so I'm just going to say tuple.1. And there you go. All right. Now, there's a third collection type that I might get beat up for saying calling it a collection type, but it does exist, right? So there's sort of the keyed and unkeyed versions of arrays and tuples, but there's also structs and classes, right? So I'm going to say struct numbers, and we need a way to wrap this collection, and in the case of Swift it uses curly braces, and a lot of other languages do it as well. And then I'm going to say let 1 equal 1, and I don't need semicolons. This is probably the biggest problem with me moving between Swift and PHP, is semicolons or not semicolons. So Swift or let 3 equal 3. So now we have the struct. Now how do we gain access to the contents of that thing, right? Well, we just type in numbers. We put in parentheses because we do need an instance in the case of a struct or a class, right? It needs to be put into memory. And we're just going to say 1. And so there we go. We have 1. And there is nuance between these, but they do effectively the same thing. There's one thing on the left, and we're assigning it to one thing on the right that may be made up of one or more things, right? Be it characters, be it numbers, be it whatever. So let's head back to our code and take a look at what's going on here with regard to this returning an associative array with left and right. So one thing that I've heard people sort of offer as the reason behind their criticism of using associative arrays as a tuple is that it just aesthetically looks horrible to them. And so, that's fine. How about we do keys equals array left, right. And I'm going to say values or vals, just to make it line up correctly, equals left and right. And then we're going to say return. Let me leave that where it is for now. We're going to say return array merge? No, combine. So array combine is a standard library function that will take two arrays. The first array should be an array of strings, and the strings will be converted to keys as a one-to-one match to the values that are in the second array. So in theory, all of that should pass. All right. So basically, we can forget about those 4 lines. Now, one of the other things. And do I actually want to do this? Yes. So one of the other things is that people don't like, like if you're into prose, like trying to write prose code, you have a tendency to want to avoid bringing back an array, right? You want to have the ability to give object notation. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to check to see how many of these I'm going to have to mess with. So it'll only be 3. Okay. So what you can do in PHP and a lot of other languages is you can typecast something. And I don't mean this in the true Hollywood story, this is why my career sucks kind of way. It's basically saying, array combined is going to return an array. That's the type of object that it returns, or the type of thing that it returns. And what we're going to say is we're going to say, you know what, parenthesis object. And that basically tells PHP, look, do array combine the way you normally do. But then once you get that done, what I want to do is I want to convert that collection from being an array, and I want to make it into effectively an instantiated object with public properties of the values of the keys. All right, now, so this should break our code, and it does. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for where we're using bisected array, and I am going to leave it as saying array for now. That might change. So array left, and in theory, something should have changed there. Array left, and I'm going to make an arrow here to say array right. Not digging this so far. Because none of my errors are going away. But I'm going to write it out. Okay. So bisected array, oh, that's why. So bisected array, we said that we wanted it to return an array, but then we turned it into an object. So the return value is actually an object, or otherwise known as a standard object. Okay, that still didn't work. Instance of standard class. Oh. Really? Oh. Maybe the backslash. There we go. So, sorry. So, it couldn't, PHP couldn't figure out what I meant by object. And so it says, it's returning a standard class, so that's actually a helpful error message. And when it said that it couldn't find 8-fold /string standard class, basically I just prepended it with a backslash and said, there's something inside of PHP, a class inside PHP, find it. And so when it did, we got that. And so that works. Now this is all well and good, but this isn't going to help us with split, right? Because basically we're doing the same thing, right? We have left, right, and left is an array slice of an array starting at 0 and going as far as we want it to, an arbitrary number, right? And then we have right, which is kind of the same thing, but it starts at max splits and just goes to the end. And we can't do it from bisected array because, well, bisected array works on a different style of string. So what we're going to do is we're going to do extract method and of this code here. Okay, and some IDEs and even some, I think, packages inside of Sublime Text can, you can highlight some text and right click and say I want to do extract method, and then it'll sort of help walk you through it. I have a tendency to want to continue to practice doing a lot of these by hand, because you never know when you're going to be in somebody else's code base and they're not going to have those tools. And it allows me to, just be in any situation I want to be in and go, hey, this is what we need to do. So I'm going to create a class method that will bisect an array. So first things first, we're going to say static. I'm going to say private. Oh, wait. Function. So I'm going to make it a private method. And the reason I'm going to make it a private method is because, technically speaking, a string class shouldn't really be playing with arrays too much, right? If this started with a string somehow, then sure, right? We could do that. But this is literally just going to be acting on an array that we receive, which is why we can make it into a class method. And it's going to act in the same way on that array, and then it's going to return, now it's going to return a standard class, right? And so I want to keep that private, right? Just like, you don't want to know that your neighbor is a sleeper cell spy and can kill you with a spork. You much rather just know that they, drive a nice car and seem to barbecue every weekend. So there's that, and we should be, in theory, okay, and we are. Now, one last thing that I'm going to do on bisected array real quick is I'm basically going to say, instead of being really explicit about the array and setting the array, I'm just going to go ahead and call this array inside of the bisectArray method call. Because that to me is pretty easy to read. Okay, we're about to bisect an array. What array? This array. Got it. How did we get to this array? Well, preg split, blah 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 blah. Right? Like if you want to unpack it, you totally can. All right. So now this is where it gets kind of interesting. Do we really need to be fussing about object notation? Right? Because that's why we changed down here the bisected array, right? Array arrow left, because it basically deletes two single primes and then two square brackets, right? And it's object notation, and we replace those 4 characters with just 2 characters, which is a hyphen and a right angle bracket. But what if we could do this in a different way? And so basically, what if we could assign one collection directly to another collection, right? Similar to what we're doing up here with the keys and the values, right? This is taking one collection and taking 2 collections, and we're assigning the values in one to the values in another, 1 to 1. So we actually can do that with variables inside of functions in PHP. There's a language, can't remember what they call it, language feature or something. And basically it's called list, and so it's list parenthesis, so that's how we're telling PHP this is a group of stuff, and hopefully you understand it. And then, so left and right, and then we can say this bisect array. Oh, I actually wanted, fix that later. And so what array? Well, array, and then where max splits. And so now we should be able to delete those 2 lines, right? Because this this resets or recalibrates right to be a string again. And so stuff's going to blow up, and that's okay. Cannot use standard class as array. Okay, so basically we can't cast this to an object and use it that way and take advantage of that. So let's go ahead and do this. And again, stuff's going to blow up. Bisected array must be of a standard class, and it's not. So let's come down here, and we're going to say array. Okay, invalid arguments passed to implode when we check for suffix and that sort of a thing. And that's really because we really want to commit to, oh, sorry. So let me, subrange reversed. Yeah, so basically the other part about list is that it can't be a keyed array. It has to be an index array. So what we're going to do is we're basically just going to comment this out, and I'm going to say left, right, inside of the array combine, and we're still fixing things. Should have an equal number, both parameters should have an equal number of, oh, I don't want to do array combine anymore. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to return an array that is left and right. So we fixed a couple of things there. Still getting invalid arguments, which I still understand why. Array shift, null given, right? All right, so let's figure out split real quick. Actually, I think split's figured out. So bisected array at, right? So this is now giving us two things. So we could say, because this is left, I should be able to say array 0, and that fixes 3 errors. And if I say array 1, that fixes another error. And if we say here array 0 and array 1, that fixes the other errors. But why not just go ahead and do what we did up above, right? Why do we keep having to inflate this? And partially because it's easy to read, but if you understand what list is doing, or can even infer what list is doing, where basically you have a property left and right, there's an array, so something's going on with that array, and we just keep using left and right. So I can kind of understand what's going on there, and so the tests are still passing. We're going to scroll back up, and instead of array 1, we're going to say list and say left, right, and we're going to say right. Actually, so there's a language feature or a methodology that keeps getting used where it's like, we're not going to use this, but we're going to use this other thing. And so, setting this variable to being an underscore, I think would help in reading this and understanding what's going on there. So just using conventions from other languages to help us out. So $, or this is going to be left and right. So not using the tuple, we're going to say left. And let's see if our test pass. So our test pass. Right? Now again, the drawback here is that somebody has to know from technically not the standard library, but from the language itself, what list does, right? And we can go ahead and do this. And yes, I could put array slice array into the return value and array slice the second one into the return value, but that makes it more abstract, right? So going back to things that you can sort of master, the concrete of scuba is self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, right? Like you, from that sentence, you understand. Now from scuba, you have to unpack that, right? And from the word scuba, you kind of have to know, unless you know what an aqualung is, right? Because you're probably going to go looking for what an aqualung is. So maybe we could do that, in fact. So aqualung, call self-contained underwater breathing apparatus aqualung instead of self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. And I forgot to do the let or var. I think that was the error. Yeah. So everything seems to be aqualung. This is why you shouldn't change things when you're closing stuff up. Anyway, right. So self-contained breathing, underwater breathing apparatus, you totally, scuba. We're just going to shorten that. I get it, you get it, everybody gets it. And then eventually that becomes a word, so now it becomes a double unpacking, right? So scuba, the definition is an aqualung. Well, what's an aqualung? Well, it's a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. And so on and so forth, right? Just unpacking and unpacking. Because the more you abstract something, right, abstract away from the concrete, the more difficult it can be to understand what's going on. Now, what's interesting about software development, at least from my, one of the things that's interesting about software development, is that the more we abstract away from the machine code of binary, right, 1 0 0 0 1 1 1 1 1, I don't know what I just said, so if I said something nasty, I'm sorry. The more we abstract is the closer we get to more of prose, right? But we still don't like writing a lot of code, and we still need to be able to transport this stuff easily. And so we have a tendency to continue to add these features and functions to the standard libraries of these languages to make it so that you don't need to write that from scratch. You can just use stuff from the standard library. So anyhow, that's it for today. Thank you for making the time. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully this was helpful. And I will see you next time.